This story of Claire Radish began with unexpected news that was announced within the walls of the Royal Academy. The girl was supposed to marry the prince, but during the gala ball she was accused of inability to use magical abilities and responded with a sudden refusal. The laughing, fair-haired young man playfully ruined all her plans for life by announcing that he was terminating their engagement. The girl with pink hair, who was holding Prince Oliver's arm happily, said that she even felt a little sorry for poor Claire. The fair-haired young mistress looked at what was happening with calm blue eyes and fanned herself with a large lace fan. Outside, spectators silently watched the scene taking place and shrugged their shoulders in bewilderment. The guy continuing the monologue said that Radish has magical abilities but refuses to use them, and also abuses his position by pouring out negativity on Carol. Claire continued to stand calmly and listen to insults, covering herself with a black fan like a shield. Despite the outward calm, passions were raging inside. She was ready to beat the short-lived heir thoroughly, just to bring him to his senses. Their engagement happened 7 years ago, when they were much younger, in fact children, and Oliver was a whole year younger than Radish. Then the guy entered the Royal Academy, and since then the girl was forced to help him in everything, and close his gaps in knowledge with her abilities. The prince, moreover, was also a decent egoist, who, having risen a little higher than others, immediately imagined himself to be the center of the universe, which offended many peers and students. Moreover, having received a bit of power, Oliver began to allow himself to interfere in martial arts tournaments, where he used manipulation to achieve fake fights. At the last cultural festival, the heir recklessly used the name of his own father to attract maximum attention to his personal project. And Claire took the rap for all this, diligently smoothing out conflicts and quarrels, since she was his fiancée and had some rights and responsibilities associated with this circumstance. And to cap all the troubles, the prince falls in love with a silly little girl with pink hair, who is just the daughter of a baron, and publicly breaks off his engagement to Claire, the daughter of the Margrave. Equality cannot be drawn between these two heirs of noble families, since Carol is much lower in social status than her rival, so the choice of the prince only speaks of his immaturity. And while Oliver continues to publicly humiliate Radish, the girl thinks that she must do something immediately, otherwise the current ball will be completely ruined. The young student pays attention to her fingers because they are covered with ingrained ink from the many scrolls and manuscripts she has gone through recently. Then Claire turns her gaze to her rival, who hugs the prince tightly by the arm and presses herself against his shoulder. Her thin and delicate hands, with nails varnished to match her hair color, have a dazzlingly clean appearance. Next, the prince began to get personal and reproach his ex-bride for wearing gloomy clothes. The guy also remembered that his mother, the queen, had always opposed their union. After these words, Radish began to think seriously. Meanwhile, the careless rake went on a new round of accusations, and again voiced his first thought that the girl has magical abilities, but she avoids using them in every possible way. Claire asked the prince to repeat what his mother had said about her, and Oliver happily voiced the unpleasant remark. And then he added that the girl constantly takes advantage of her position as a bride, and at the same time ignores magic. The modest student thought that perhaps what was happening to her now was just a new step on the path to better things. The crowd of acquaintances and friends who had gathered around stood silently at some distance, exchanging glances and making meaningful faces. Claire thought that she, of course, could accept a disagreement with her fiancé and endure this blow steadfastly, but then she would be considered weak and defenseless, incapable of fighting. The bride slammed her fan noisily and thought that this situation could have an unpleasant impact on her father, the Margrave. Radish looked closely at the prince and decided to stand up for herself. She was pretty tired of correcting his stupid mistakes over the years. After waiting for a pause in the groom's rude monologue, Claire raised 3 fingers up and asked him if he knew what it was. Oliver answered in the affirmative and said that he saw 3 fingers raised up. The Margrave's heiress parried the answer and recalled that it was 3 times that she offered the young heir to dissolve their union. At these words, the guy shuddered and turned pale. His face covered with cold sweat and his eyes widened. He clearly did not expect such a step. Raising one finger up and talking about the first termination, Claire clarified that she was 15 years old at the time, and she admitted to the prince that she could not use magic. At that time, this reason seemed significant enough to her to talk about ending the relationship. The girl thought, looking at the table beautifully decorated with flowers opposite them. Under the gaze of the crowd, the bride said that for the first time she was asked to wait until she was 16 years old, in the hope of awakening the magical gift later. Having reached the above age, Claire again suggested that the groom end the relationship since magical abilities did not manifest themselves in any way, and at these words, the prince felt bad. But the girl was refused and asked to be patient and wait further while a similar situation repeated itself a year later. The last time Radish added one more argument to the lack of magic, Oliver liked Carol, a pretty girl with pink hair, and he began to pay more attention to her than to the bride. The prince shouted at the girl that all her words from beginning to end were an absolute lie. Closing her eyes, Claire replied that what she said was easy to check, because every time she drew up an official statement about a change in status, which means it was preserved in archival documents. The girl paused and looked at the harmonious bouquet of flowers located in a vase on the table. And then she struck the decisive blow, remembering that the last time Oliver dissuaded her in writing from terminating the union, saying that magic was not the main thing and Carol was only temporary entertainment. And these were not just words, but real handwritten messages sent to her family. Having said this, the bride opened her fan again. Then the girl remembered that the prince's last letter written a month ago contained instructions related to the student council, from which a huge amount of work followed. And in order to fulfill Oliver's instructions, Claire did a titanic job and didn't even always have time to sleep. And now when she met the deadline and came to the ball, she is informed about the breakup. Radish called this behavior of the heir cruel and slowly looked around at those present who greedily absorbed her every word. Green-eyed Carol was still looking at her chosen one, but there was no longer tenderness and love in this look, and the prince still could not come to his senses and looked ridiculous and disgraced. Claire also remembered that she had a witness, her personal bodyguard, assigned to a girl who had the status of the prince's fiancée and also offered to bring up the document records. Radish once again mentioned that correspondence between noble families is always preserved and carefully stored, which means that her words are easy to verify. As for the accusations of bullying young Carol, this is unfounded, because the bride physically did not have time to think about anything else other than the extensive work carried out on behalf of the prince. The smart student carefully watched the sensation her performance created. Those gathered actively whispered and discussed what they had heard, and occasionally rude words were heard addressed to the prince. Claire didn't care about Oliver. She clearly understood that with her active defensive position, she saved the reputation of her father and the whole family, regardless of whether the engagement continued or not. After waiting a long theatrical pause, Radish closed her fan and turned to the prince. Having curtsied respectfully in front of the heir to the royal family, the girl smiled sweetly and said that she was ready to terminate their 7-year relationship. Claire then turned around and went about her business, as she still had some completed work to turn in, and then she planned to head home. Finally, Radish asked for forgiveness from those gathered for the fact that they became unwitting witnesses to the scene that played out. But the ex-bride didn't have time to leave. She couldn't even take a step. An order was heard prohibiting her from leaving this place, and then the girl was surrounded by strong guys. The guard unceremoniously grabbed the fragile girl by the hand, painfully squeezing her shoulder with his fingers. Claire tried to break free and screamed, but then the second guard arrived and tenaciously cuffed her other hand. Never before had Radish felt so weak and helpless, squeezed on both sides and with no chance of freedom. At this moment of desperate emotional breakdown, somewhere deep, deep inside, Claire felt a strange, tight wave rising and filling her to the brim. The last thing the girl remembered before plunging into darkness and losing consciousness were the voices of those around her talking about the awakened magical power. When the former bride came to her senses at first, it was painful for her to even open her eyes. A strange and unusual feeling permeated her whole body. Overcoming weakness. Radish managed to sit up on the bed and look around. This place looked like a small cell with heavy bars. This unusual combination of soft pillows and thick rods somewhat confused the girl. Claire had planned to go home after the ball, but instead she ended up in prison. The last thing she remembered was a strange wave inside and words about magic. But what happened to her next is a complete mystery. The ceiling of the prison was quite high, but the room could not be called spacious. Her hands still remembered the strong hugs of the guards, and this memory made Claire feel uneasy. Apparently, at a moment of extreme despair and emotional stress, Radish awakened the internal supernatural forces that had been dormant until then. But what happened after this incident, and for what reason was she put in prison? Claire went to the window and, holding the cold bars with her hands, looked out into the street where she saw a high stone wall and several trees. This meant only one thing. After the incident, the girl was transported to the king's palace. Most likely the prince directly had a hand in this. He always disliked her, and now he has a real reason to get even. Saving her personal reputation and family honor, Radish somehow did not think that she had disgraced the heir to the empire, which means that the king and queen also suffered damage. Most of all, Claire feared the queen because this powerful woman could destroy anyone who stood in her way. What would she do with the one who publicly disgraced her son? The Empress could easily vent her resentment on the Radish family and turn their existence into a living nightmare. And to prevent this, I must be free. Then me and my loved ones will have at least some chance, Claire thought. The girl's first thought was that she could feign some kind of illness and then take advantage of the situation and escape. Then the former bride suggested that there was an option to persuade the guards or simply try to somehow hide from them. Suddenly, Radish's train of thought was interrupted by a loud meow that came from somewhere behind her. The amazed girl turned around and saw a tabby cat lying on her pillow. But after taking a closer look, Claire realized that it was not just a cat, but a real catshi. These felines do resemble regular furry pets, but they are actually wild animals with some serious magical powers. And the older the catshi becomes, the stronger his magical gift. They are usually used by practicing magicians as a pet and assistant. Radish squatted down closer to the animal and began to carefully examine it. She had never seen them so close before. Fluffy was clearly in a friendly mood. He purred, and wagged his tail held high. The girl felt somehow uneasy because she did not know how to behave correctly in this situation. In addition, the Katsha had a collar with a medallion on her neck, which means that someone hung it, and this pet belongs to someone. Claire put her hand next to the cat's paw and spoke in a gentle and kind voice. Radish introduced herself, said that she had gotten here quite recently, and asked the animal where she was. Suddenly the cat opened her mouth and answered in a human voice that they were in prison near the gate in the northern part of the palace. The girl stared at her pet in amazement. She could not even imagine that they could communicate in an understandable language. Just in case she even asked if it was true that Kachi was talking to her. The cat frowned slightly and confirmed that she really knew how to talk to people. Radish jumped up as if stung and screamed she was so amazed by this news. In response to such a strong emotional reaction, the Kachi hissed and fluffed her tail with a trumpet. Then the cat rose on its hind legs and began waving its front legs, telling the girl to calm down. Otherwise, she would give away the pet with her squeal. Realizing that she was behaving like a timid little girl, Claire immediately fell silent and asked for forgiveness. The ex-bride leaned forward and began to listen carefully to the cat, who began to talk about the difficult situation in which the Royal Academy student found herself. While the fluffy animal was describing the current picture, Radish nervously fiddled with the hem of her dress. And it's not surprising because the cat said that Claire turns out to be a real witch, the same as the cats. From what she heard, the girl immediately felt uneasy, and she swallowed the lump that had formed in her throat. According to legend, witches are born extremely rarely, only about 10 per century, and can use special witchcraft spells unlike wizards who use elemental magic. Kachi finished speaking and summed up that Radish as a witch awakened quite recently and has not yet realized herself. Claire was still trying to collect her thoughts, so she began to speak out loud. Now the girl finally understood why, despite her impressive magical potential, she still could not realize it, because she had only tried the magic of the 4 elements inaccessible to witches. The pet confirmed Radish's guess and agreed that the usual magical arsenal was inaccessible to them. Leaning back on the pillow, the cat added that all these years the witch had wasted time and energy pointlessly trying to open the chest of opportunities with the wrong key. Looking at the heavy and thick bars of her prison, Claire noted that she was in an extremely difficult position. The pet meowed affirmatively and reminded the girl of what they do with witches in this kingdom. However, Radish knew this even without being reminded. Witches in the state were outlawed. They were hated and discriminated against in every possible way. It's scary to even think what will happen to them, now her loved ones. Raising her paw and meowing, the cat interrupted Claire's heavy thoughts, noticing that she had two proposals for the prisoner at once. The first is to stay in prison and trust your fate, and the second is to escape with the Kachi away from here. The newly made witch thought about it because she didn't know how to do the right thing so as not to make things worse. Finally, Radish made a decision and asked the cat how she could help her escape from this dungeon. Kachi agreed to help because they are both witches whom others hate, do not understand, and do not want to accept into their society. Then the pet added that Claire would owe her for this help, but did not say what exactly. The furball suggested rolling up a pillow and placing it under the blanket to make it look like a sleeping person, and then cast an invisibility spell and literally disappeared. Radish took the cat in her arms, and the spell also engulfed her body, so that the dungeon room was instantly empty. The pet added that only an experienced magician could reverse the spell. After a while, steps were heard behind the wall, and an unknown shadow approached the bars. It was a young woman in a maid uniform who brought a table of food. Moving closer to the bed, she began to look at the protruding blanket and thought. And indeed, it looked like someone was lying under the blanket. Taking advantage of the opportunity while the woman was moving the dishes from the mobile table to the bedside table, Claire and the cats left the room. In the next corridor, 2 guards were bored by the passage, but since the spell worked properly, the guards, although they looked directly at the witch, did not notice anything. Walking in a state of invisibility was somewhat strange and unusual. The main thing was to move as quietly as possible and press tightly against the walls so that you would not be accidentally hit by an elbow. With such a quiet and stealthy gait wandering through labyrinths and passages, the companions finally left the dungeon. In the arms of the pensive Claire lay her new furry friend. The cat's eyes literally shone with joy. The 2 witches then went straight through the small grove that separated the prison building from the outer perimeter of the city walls. Radish thought that they had one last obstacle to overcome on the path to freedom, the city gates. Having walked more than half the way, Claire suddenly froze because a loud male voice was heard behind her, ordering her to stop immediately. Kachi meowed sadly that this magician was really experienced, and he probably served at court since he was able to see them under the cover of invisibility. The man called out to Radish again, saying that he had been watching her since she left the dungeon doors and wanted her to turn around and show her face. The young witch followed the order and looked at the guy with her wide blue eyes. The stranger continued to glare at the girl, but he no longer had the confidence that had previously sounded in his voice. Claire recognized this man and was very surprised to find him here at such a time. This was Prince Gilbert, known throughout the kingdom as Casanova, and a rake whose adventures were repeatedly passed down from mouth to mouth by popular rumor, and about whom legends were almost made up. There was a bad reputation among people about this man, that the heir to the throne does not want to get married only because he prefers to regularly change the object of his desire and loves to break hearts. And now Gilbert stood directly opposite the fugitive and looked at her with all his eyes. Claire also couldn't look away. She didn't know what to do now because the escape was discovered, and even by a relative of her ex-fiancé. Radish was thinking about why of all the magicians, of whom there were quite a lot within the castle walls, it was Gilbert who met her. Oliver's elder brother was also the first prince, and in addition to his excessive love for the opposite sex, was distinguished by his composure, arrogance, and calmness. In addition to the above-mentioned qualities, Casanova inherited a serious magical gift from his mother, and also skillfully wielded bladed weapons for which he received the title of Knight Commander. But of course, everyone considered Gilbert's irresistible attraction to the opposite sex to be his main property, since it was no longer possible to count the number of broken hearts and ruined destinies. Radish met him many times and always tried to stay as far away from the first prince as possible, because communication with him promised nothing but trouble. The Knight Commander saw this attitude but never tried to change anything, probably because Claire was still the fiancée of his younger brother. Radish recalled their short meetings in the past and understood that now it would be very difficult to get rid of this man. Gilbert looked into those big blue eyes of the fugitive and also thought intensely about something. Suddenly, noise and screams came from the prison doors that Claire had escaped. The girl swallowed and thought that this was the end of her adventure. She stood there unable to move and couldn't even think about anything. A heavy emptiness hung inside her from the impending inevitable end. Suddenly, the first prince with a deft movement took off his cloak from his shoulder and threw it on the girl, saying that this should help her leave the palace unnoticed. Radish didn't know what to say. She was already in some kind of stupor from the fact that the escape had been discovered, and now suddenly hope came out of nowhere. The Knight Commander then asked if she had a safe place where she could hide. The girl answered in the affirmative. She still did not believe that the man whom she had considered an absolute scoundrel for so many years was saving her in such a difficult situation. Then the Kachi raised her voice and asked if they would really be safe, and having received an affirmative answer, she meowed joyfully. Suddenly, Gilbert raised his finger as if he remembered something and pointed to his former cloak. The prince drew the fugitive's attention to the fact that there was some money in his pocket that could be useful to them on the road. Claire was extremely surprised by this turn of events. She asked why Oliver's brother was allowing them to escape. Gilbert replied that he knew her well enough to be sure of her innocence. Radish couldn't believe her ears and didn't understand how this was even possible, because now standing in front of her was a completely different person, completely different from the one who appeared in urban legends as a womanizer. The next moment, the commander of the Knights turned around sharply. 2 guards appeared behind him. They were intensely looking for someone. The guys reported to their senior rank that they were looking for a fugitive who had left the walls of the prison and asked if the prince had seen anyone suspicious here. Gilbert calmly lied to them, covering Radish with his back, and also said that he was walking from the northern gate through which the girl planned to escape, thereby clearing the way for her to escape. Further, the cunning prince said that he would take part in the search and even began to command the guards, directing them along the wrong trail. It was late at night, and the jailers were very glad to receive any help. Having sent his pursuers in the opposite direction, the first prince showed the fugitives the right path, extending his finger in a safe direction. Wrapped in a huge cloak, Claire whispered words of gratitude, hugged her furry friend tighter, and hurried away. Safely covered with an impenetrable cover, Radish felt much more confident and calm. 3 days later, an extremely unpleasant conversation for the participants took place in the royal chambers. The queen sat on a comfortable sofa and asked her son and his new passion about the events that had happened. Oliver and Carol turned red and pale as they confusedly told their version of what happened at the Royal Academy ball. The queen mother was very annoyed that Claire managed to leave the castle walls in her absence, and also accused her son of using brute physical force against his former bride. The guy replied that the mother herself had given him an example of how to treat a woman without magical abilities. The sorceress agreed, but noted that breaking off the engagement in public was very stupid and thoughtless. Then she looked at the tea in the porcelain cup. Oliver didn't know what to answer because he really went too far, and with his behavior not only set himself up, but also disgraced the royal family. Then the anger of the mistress of the castle switched to Carol, who was also far from reasonable in her actions. The queen straightened her lush fan and reminded the girl with pink hair and her origin. And then Oliver's mother reproached the student for her stupidity and senseless lies about Claire, which were easy to refute. To which Carol began to cry and began to make excuses to her possible mother-in-law that Radish really offended her and humiliated her in every possible way. The queen mother laughed and suddenly sided with her former bride, noting that Claire was only teaching Carol the rules of etiquette that all nobles should know from a young age. Oliver intervened and tried to defend his new chosen one, noting that Radish allowed herself too much and that everything was serious between him and Carol. The king's wife just shook her head, closed her eyes, and sadly noted that the children simply did not understand all the consequences of the act they had committed. The prince froze in bewilderment, since it seemed to him that although he had been a little stupid, he had acted correctly until that moment. Radish did. Oliver listened with fear in his chest to the words that his success from social work at the Royal Academy should surpass the unattainable level to which Claire had risen. Then the prince overcame his internal resistance and expressed sincere agreement with the intended goal and promised that he would carry out this difficult task. As for Carol, the Queen Mother spoke in the spirit that her appearance in the life of their family only brought problems, so the girl must prove her usefulness through hard work. The young student quite calmly and even happily agreed to fulfill this condition in order to remain close to the prince in the future. Finally, the mistress of the castle noted that if the children understood everything, then she no longer dared to detain such busy people. Suddenly the woman's nerves gave way, and she, throwing her fan at the wall, began to express what was accumulating in her soul. Most of all, the queen was irritated by the act of her son and his new chosen one, because they did it on the eve of the election of the crown prince, and now Gilbert had clearly taken first place. The fact is that the older brother had previously surpassed the younger one in terms of mastery of magic and a sharp blade, but he flatly refused to choose a bride for himself who Oliver already had. And suddenly, on the eve of such an important event, the youngest son unexpectedly breaks off his engagement with a suitable passion, Claire, the daughter of an influential margrave, exchanging her for the inexperienced heiress of a modest baron. The Queen Mother closed her eyes and began to think hard about the current situation. She was very worried about the disappearance of her former bride from the dungeon. The king's wife remembered that Radish was a very convenient candidate. Her talents and diligence perfectly raised her son's reputation, so it was easy and simple to use the girl for her own purposes. The mistress of the palace thought that now she would have to make a lot of efforts so that the girl would not only return to work for the royal family, but also take responsibility for Oliver's action. The crown prince's mother had long practiced her charms on the modest girl, forcing her to work hard and protect her son from any troubles. The queen was surprised by the fact that despite the magical order that forbade the girl to leave her family, Radish managed to overcome it. However, the mistress of the palace was sure that this was only a temporary difficulty in the life path of her family. 3 weeks after fleeing the royal palace, Claire was still in a quiet and secluded place, hiding from possible persecution. The girl took advantage of the home of her new cat friend, and just at that moment was standing near a large cauldron where another potion was being brewed. Possessing a certain passion for knowledge, Radish carefully studied the Book of Spells and diligently followed the recipe from the book while preparing the composition. Mixing a lot of unusual ingredients, Claire comprehended this new science which was to become her calling. Considering the hard work and attentiveness of the novice witch, brewing potions turned out to be not as difficult as one might think. Gradually, one after another, the smart girl mastered more and more new drugs, starting with very simple ones, and gradually moving on to more complex recipes. Carried away by her work, the prince's former bride did not even notice how much time she spent at the large cauldron. The bright sun was shining outside the window and persistently called Claire for a short walk. The grass was bright, lush, and green, covered with a bizarre pattern of shadows cast by the leaves of the trees. Such a calm and measured life in the wilderness was unusual for the hard-working student, because she was accustomed to a completely different rhythm of life, eventful and intense. Closing her eyes, Radish yawned sweetly and stretched. She had nowhere to rush, and the realization of this fact was difficult. A strange thought suddenly flashed through my head, that from the moment of engagement, all these long 7 years had passed in a kind of stupor and endless work without normal rest and relaxation. Then there were only 2 princes in the kingdom, one of whom already had a bride. Unfortunately, this couple died during a terrible illness that swept the country. The ruling elite faced a difficult choice: to place the burden of succession on the third Prince Gilbert, born of the king's favorite, or Oliver, the fourth son of the queen herself, who at that time was only 9 years old. And everyone predicted the title of actual heir to the son of his mistress, but her sudden death sharply reduced the son's chances of succession to the throne. At that time, a battle literally broke out in the palace between influential factions, some supporting the descendant of the favorite and others the son of the queen. But the mistress of the palace made a cunning maneuver. She arranged the engagement of the young prince to the heiress of Margrave Radish and got him into the Royal Academy, significantly strengthening Oliver's position among the applicants. Then Claire was a 10-year-old little girl, living without worries on the estate of her influential father. From an early age, the little girl spent hours in the large family library. Even then, she liked to read and showed a natural thirst for knowledge. Plunging into the magical world created on the pages of many books, the Margrave's heiress dreamed of going on a long journey to personally see the miracles described in the lines. But the mistress of the kingdom, who was once a court magician, had her own plans for the life and fate of the promising girl. Radish was not only a convenient choice in terms of court intrigue and influence, but also possessed impressive magical powers locked deep within. In fact, Claire was taken from her parents' home against the will of her family, who did not dare to refuse the royal court. Since then, the girl's fate has changed greatly. She was forced to do what she was told so as not to expose her family, and actually ended up in indefinite service. Radish still remembered the very first day she met the Queen Oliver's mother. This meeting was not one-on-one. There was someone else present there, quite unexpected for the young girl. The stately elderly woman also took part in introducing the prince's possible daughter-in-law and mother. In an authoritative voice, the stranger demanded that the girl introduce herself to the queen. At the sound of her words, Claire literally began to shake, something that had never happened to her before. Having overcome herself, the future daughter-in-law was still able to perform the action required of her. However, this only angered the strange woman with big glasses so much, so that she literally took off right off the bat. Finding herself on the green grass, the poor thing did not even immediately understand what had happened to her, but she felt severe pain. It turns out that the stranger brought a flexible whip with her and just used it in full force on a little girl. And then the woman began to read Radish morals, not the topic of how to behave in front of a special royal. Overcoming the pain, Claire tried to follow these instructions and said hello again. But the stranger was dissatisfied with the diligence shown and forced the girl to continue trying until she saw the desired result. Finally, the torture was over and the demands were fulfilled, but the poor thing's soul was bad. The prince's mother watched all this action calmly and with a smile, and then greeted the girl and invited her to sit next to her. Radish obeyed. She was still in pain, both physical and psychological, and was afraid of doing something wrong. Since then, the stranger has become a permanent person assigned to the prince's future bride and potential queen. Her task was to instill the manners of high society through the pain. The blows were always strong and biting. They caused a strong burning sensation and incredible resentment, so Claire's eyes were constantly wet with tears at first. It was the tender women's hands that suffered the most. Sometimes there was literally no living space on them. During the next audience with the queen, she noticed that the heiress Radish was literally changing before her eyes and was becoming closer to the image of a real lady with each meeting. It was true, Claire changed quite quickly. Through the pain, the girl learned one lesson after another, so that soon there was no trace left of the dreamy child. Then the prince's mother said that they would see each other in this gazebo more often, since she wanted to personally observe the development of her son's passion. But the cruel tests were only part of an extensive program for raising the future queen. For example, sleep deprivation was practiced. And even when Radish tried to sleep, she was tormented by new endless difficulties. The queen sometimes ordered that a sleeping child be grabbed, wrapped in a blanket, tied up, and left to lie in an uncomfortable position. The maids meekly followed the mistress's instructions and even did their work with diligence. Curled up like a roll, the girl could not move, experienced attacks of suffocation, and was sweating profusely. For a significant period of time, Claire was required to study various subjects. In fact, she was forced to learn colossal amounts of heterogeneous information. It was very disappointing to go through all this, especially because Radish did not explain why this was necessary at all. The solution turned out to be very simple. It turns out that her future husband, little Oliver, was a very weak boy in all respects, and Claire had to compensate for his shortcomings. And the mother hoped that by training her future passion in different directions, she would save her son from at least some of the problems that he would inevitably get into. And the boy became so undeveloped due to the fact that he was initially born only the fourth in the family, and initially no one was betting on him at all in terms of a possible coronation. However, fate decreed otherwise, and as a result of the tragic death of the remaining possible heirs, only two remained. Gilbert received the status of the first prince and Oliver, the second. One day, the queen called the Margrave's heiress, who was growing up before her eyes, to her and told her important news. Her son will have to take the place of heir to the entire kingdom, and Claire will become his faithful support. And the girl diligently began to carry out the orders of Her Highness by hook or by crook, protecting the young prince from his own mistakes and stupidities. Radish was sad, lonely, and hard, but she diligently pulled the strap for the frivolous Oliver while he had fun and enjoyed the fruits of her labors. The boy was not only stupid, but also a very active boy, so he came up with more and more new ideas, the consequences of which had to be sorted out by his bride. And every time Claire quickly rushed to the rescue, ready to expose herself to the blow, so that the prince would not get hurt, and the queen was pleased with her. Sometimes the girl even went against her parents just to have the opportunity to be closer to the illustrious family of the country's rulers. Now Radish was sincerely glad that the engagement was broken. She only now began to understand the true reasons for her fanatical work and devotion. Hearing footsteps in the hallway, the girl joyfully rushed to meet her mentor. The witch bore the name Ram, and was not at all like all her previous teachers and educators. Taking on the guise of a cat, the new friend literally saved Claire's life, pulling her out of prison and sheltering her on the grounds of her home. The mentor asked if Radish had time to prepare the necessary potion during her absence. The young witch answered in the affirmative, her face shining with joy, because she was not doing something under the duress of the royal family. It turns out that Ram was engaged in mass production of all kinds of medicinal drugs. The hostess brought a whole bag of sweets and invited Claire to brew hot and aromatic tea. Radish loved small joys very much because she missed them so much during the years of serving the prince. The witch replied that she specifically chose the cookies her guest liked. There was their own gazebo waiting for them in the garden, where there was a small table and 2 chairs. It was very cozy and comfortable there. Claire really loved these cookies. They were delicious with tea. Ram watched with a smile and joy as this little worker, bound by obligations, finally got the opportunity to spread her wings and gain freedom. Finally, the hostess decided to interrupt the silent idyll and share news from the city. The aspiring sorceress cleaned herself up after passionately eating sweets and prepared to listen. Looking at the cup of amber tea, Ram began her story by identifying 3 themes. The first was that there was talk in the city about Claire's flight to the lands of her influential father, and that the prince regularly sent flowers there. Radish was somewhat surprised by this news and did not believe that Oliver would actually send her flowers. The second was the beginning of large-scale construction on the Margrave's estate. Probably the royal family, wanting to make amends for the incident, allocated a decent amount for this. Here, the heiress of the family was forced to agree because she knew quite well about her father's current financial condition and his unpreparedness for such projects. After Radish successfully settled into her new place, she immediately wrote a letter to her father, in which she told about the revealed potential of the witch, and that she had found a safe place. Looking at the cup of tea, Claire remembered that she did not know how the parent would take the news about his daughter becoming a witch, but the Margrave took the side of the heiress. Parents were always worried that their daughter was engaged to the prince, and at the same time was not able to cast magic spells. Radish recalled sitting on a chair in the gazebo. The third news was that the troops under the command of Gilbert went on a long march to help the eastern villages that were attacked by monsters. It wasn't that Claire was particularly worried about the first prince, but the news stirred up memories of how the man had helped them escape and shown nobility. Looking at the green foliage, Ram added that it is usually not customary for crown princes to be sent on dangerous military campaigns, but too many influential people wished the guy death, and he himself was eager to go into battle. Then the mentor put her head in her hands and with a smile asked if her ward was worried about him. Radish ran her hand over the saucer and answered in the affirmative, emphasizing that Gilbert had helped them a lot then, but also noted that he was very strong, so much so that there was no need to worry too much about him. Looking at her reflection in a cup of tea, Claire added that she really wanted to thank the guy for his kind deed. Ram said that this was quite possible, she just needed to wait for his return, and added that she had always dreamed of a student who had the same witchcraft magic as hers. Radish immediately came to her senses and clarified that she would also like to thank her mentor, to which the owner of the gazebo laughed, saying that the young talent was already helping her prepare elixirs. Walking along the quiet green alley, Claire thought that her fate had changed dramatically thanks to two people, Gilbert and Ram. They were the ones who gave her the opportunity to live in peace and joy. While examining the beautiful flowers in the garden, the aspiring witch thought about what troubles she managed to avoid thanks to these good people who did not even know each other. Then Claire thought how nice it would be to meet him again, sit in the gazebo and drink tea with him, eat his favorite cookies and talk about what happened, because they never communicated normally. Radish became interested in studying this new magic for her, as well as medicine. She was helped by a mentor and a lot of thematic literature that was in the witch's house. The young student was engaged not only in theoretical training, but also actively practiced creating various elixirs, which greatly helped Ram in her work. Claire was so immersed in the sorceress's library that she did not notice how her research had turned the ordered system into a pile of jumbled reading material, which was now even falling from the shelves. Trying to restore the previous orderliness to this mass of literature, Radish found one very unusual book. The mentor noticed that her slender bookshelves had turned into impassable piles of rubble and drew the attention of the budding healer to this. Ram, to Claire's surprise, even suggested that the girl might be under a curse. The witch said that in witchcraft there are special spells that negatively affect the functions of the human body and some mental abilities. And while the surprised heiress of the Margrave listened to her with her mouth open, Ram said that the older a person is, the less susceptible he is to such influence, but children and animals are easy. While caring for the crops of medicinal herbs, Radish thought about the words of her mentor and asked herself if she could carry a curse within herself. Also fertilizing and watering the plants, the girl thought about whether she was ready for independent life. The fact is that a significant part of simple household work has always been done for her by maids, and now she was forced to immerse herself in the hustle and bustle of small tasks that ordinary people face. These painful thoughts were interrupted by an unfamiliar voice that appeared from behind. It was a young fair-haired girl about her age, dressed in a camp cape. The stranger asked for forgiveness for such a sudden appearance and said that her name was Uremi, and she was also a follower of the dark witchcraft element. Behind the new representative of such a rare magical path was a cat girl. Her name was Noah, and she was trained like Claire. Radish was very surprised by such guests. Not only are witches extremely rare creatures, but also cat people are not often encountered. The new witch stroked her pet student and noticed that such creatures are born in exceptional cases. This conversation distracted the novice gardener from the beautiful flowers growing in the garden, and the girl noticed that she had never seen a representative of the beast people in her life. She had only read about them in books. And while Uremi was signing in front of Claire showed the talents of her ward, Noah stood in complete embarrassment and blushed in front of them. Radish was completely delighted with what she heard and saw. She really liked her new acquaintances. Of particular delight was the fluffy cat's tail decorated with a large white bow and playfully sticking out from the lower back of the cat girl. Claire struggled with the desire to hug this animal. At that moment, the girl looked like a small child who happily rushes to clutch a soft toy in her arms. From the look of Noah herself, one could say that she was accustomed to such a human reaction to her person, but she did not experience much joy, but rather endured. Next, the girls headed to the house where Ram met them. She said hello and said that she was very glad to see her dear guests. The hostess reported that she had collected a fair amount of medicinal elixirs for her fellow witch, to which the blonde replied that she really should have come much earlier. Uremi justified herself by saying that she had been calibrating her magical equipment for a long time and could not be distracted until she had everything set up. Then she went after Ram to settle the accumulated matters. The witches went to inspect the finished batch of herbal healing potions that had accumulated during this time. The blonde enchantress randomly checked several vials and praised the master for the high quality of the product. Uremi clearly didn't expect the medicine to be produced in such a significant quantity, and then asked if Claire had helped in the preparation process. Ram replied that Radish prepared the entire batch personally, and at the same time exceeded the plan twice, which is why it turned out so much. To the joy of the student, the guest did not even think of getting angry. On the contrary, she noticed that the witches' potions are always in great demand. Therefore, no matter how many of them you make, there will always be few of them. The eared and tailed Noah was tasked with counting the goods and transporting the cargo. Ram invited the potion's author to help the little cat girl with this assignment. The novice healer immediately agreed. She herself really wanted to communicate with this unique creation as closely as possible. Curious Noah immediately became interested in the objects she was tasked with moving as well as their contents. Radish happily told and showed the cat girl the results of her labors. Claire clarified that each bottle has a label on the bottom that describes its contents. The humanoid cat took out a notepad and a pen and then began to write everything down in detail, creating an inventory of the shipment. The young witch was very glad that they had the opportunity to work together. She felt absolute delight from communicating with this talking kitten. Finally, the census was completed, and Noah informed her assistant. Claire picked up the piece of paper written by the Beast Man and was pleasantly surprised by how neat and understandable the handwriting of these cats' paws turned out to be. The girl with the ears wagged her tail affably and redirected her praise to her owner, who taught her everything. Speaking warm words about her mentor, Noah blushed and became embarrassed. It was noticeable how much she loved Uremi. Radish replied that she was also helping her teacher Ram, and she was very pleased to work with her new friend, to which the tailed girl noted that she was also comfortable. The two older witches meanwhile discussed business and shared news. They were glad that the students managed to get along and quickly cope with the task. Claire described this unexpected acquaintance with undisguised delight. She especially remembered Noah's beautiful and understandable handwriting. Uremi was very pleased to hear such sincere praise from a stranger, because she was the one who taught the little girl with the ears. Sitting over a cup of tea, the witch said that the girl is very smart and responsible, so she does a lot of different work in the store. Radish was very surprised when she heard that the sorceress had her own store. Claire could not even imagine that in a kingdom where witches are treated so poorly, someone could start a business selling potions and elixirs. Ram hastened to dispel her followers' ignorance, explaining that Uremi does not live here but in a neighboring kingdom, and this shop is not open to everyone, but only to initiates. Looking at the cakes, she explained that the witch's clients are not ordinary ones, but the real cream of society, among whom are both people of creative professions and influential nobles. Radish was lost in thought. For some reason, she had never thought before that somewhere there was a whole country where you could be a witch and not hide from others. Uremi said that she as a sorceress has her own specialization, namely the creation of magical tools. In particular, she is engaged in the creation of business balls. Claire remembered that they are used as proof of an agreement or a concluded agreement, since the spheres can record an image and act as confirmation of the transaction. The owner of the store confirmed her words, adding that this is a very powerful argument in resolving any dispute and is much better than a regular signature. Having compared all the facts, Radish suddenly asked if Uremi had anything to do with the portal installed in the forest. The girl replied that it was indeed her doing and praised the student for her insight. As it turned out, the teleport opened a passage directly to the witch's store. Uremi then added that she heard the news that her friend was teaching a girl from high society, an heiress of noble blood, and she became very interested in looking at the Margrave's daughter in person. The owner of the store also added that she was pleasantly surprised by this acquaintance, since she was used to seeing a lot of bad manifestations of character in aristocrats. Having joined the conversation, Ram noticed that Claire could afford to walk in the city and not sit for hours at the boiler, and communication with the opposite sex would clearly benefit her. Uremi immediately supported her colleague and asked if Radish had someone with whom she would like to communicate. The young witch immediately remembered that she had such a person, but now she was very far away. Gilbert truly left an indelible mark on her heart with his unexpected and decisive action. On the one hand, thoughts about the prince brought Claire joy, but on the other hand, the more she thought about him, the more worried she became. Sometimes the anxiety became unbearable, but the girl could not do anything about it but only quietly suffered and tried to switch to work or study. But that's not all, because deep down in the soul of the former bride there was a gaping wound left by Oliver, and Radish did not know if she could even trust his blood brother. Whatever one may say, 7 years is a long time, and after spending it with someone who was not even very worthy like the blonde heir, Claire still remembered the prince. And what bothered her most was their last meeting, when he tried to disgrace her in front of everyone and openly exchanged her for the stupid and unpromising Carol. And then Oliver also ordered her to be captured and did not even let her leave quietly, but she had faithfully served the guy and his family for 7 years. Radish will always remember this betrayal, and even though the bruises from the guard's grip passed quickly, the scar on his heart cannot be healed. And now Claire is literally torn from the inside. On the one hand, she wants to trust and love, and on the other, she is terrified of being deceived again. These painful thoughts were interrupted by Uremi noting that the student was still too young to grieve so much for anything. The owner of the elixir shop laughed and said that she remembered her youth with a smile. And then Radish wondered how old this witch was, who looked only a little older than her. Ram literally felt the questions arising in her pupil's head and immediately rushed to clarify, pointing out that her friend was about 3 times older than Claire. At first, the amazed girl couldn't believe her ears because, according to her mentor, it turned out that Uremi was over 50 years old. About 9 months have passed since the escape from the royal prison, and a golden autumn has arrived outside the window. One fine day, there was a knock on the door, and an old acquaintance, the owner of a store of witchcraft accessories, appeared on the threshold. Uremi did not come alone. She was accompanied by a serious cat girl who had not changed at all during this time. Claire happily let the guests into the house, saying that she was very glad to see them. Smiling sweetly, the witch and her assistant walked inside, and Radish was once again surprised at how young her face and skin looked. And the mentor's friend was always in a good mood and good spirits, even when discussing difficult matters. But suddenly, Uremi noticed that there was complete chaos in the house. Things were lying around and causing very unpleasant sensations. Noah confirmed the teacher's words, noting that in addition to the reigning chaos, the home was very dirty. Claire felt very ashamed in front of the guests, and she began to make excuses that there was not much dirt and the garbage was removed regularly. Uremi replied that Radish should not pay attention to her words, and said that she had brought new tea, but did not know where to sit to try it together. The young witch was delighted and invited everyone into the living room, where in her opinion there was still some free space left. The store owner agreed, but suggested that we first finish the business part of the visit and hand over the finished batch of drugs to the cat girl. And while the 2 students diligently copied the contents of wooden boxes ready to be sent to another kingdom, Uremi looked through the books lying in random places in the living room. Radish. She reported on the work done and said that she would now put the kettle on the stove. The chaos began to accumulate 3 months ago, immediately after the mentor went on a long journey to another kingdom. According to Ram, for their work, they needed special grass that grew very, very far from their home. Then the mentor gave Claire the necessary instructions, noting that over these months, the girl had mastered a sufficient amount of knowledge to independently cope with everyday responsibilities. In addition, the traveler left a rare book about witches for Radish and instructed her to carry out orders for Urami's shop. The young witch happily accepted Ram's departure, as she considered it a wonderful test for herself, because she would not sit here forever someday. She would have her own home and a separate life. However, maintaining order on one's own turned out to be very difficult, because after the mentor went on a trip, Claire was the only one left to keep an eye on him at all. Radish was embarrassed and ashamed in front of herself and others, because all her attempts to accustom herself to putting things in their places were in vain, and now she fearfully awaited the return of the mistress of the house. And when everyone was seated at the only remaining free seat, Claire suddenly put vegetables on the table for tea. Urami laughed and suggested that the young witch had mixed something up because eating tomatoes and washing them down with tea was somehow strange. The red fruits were ripe and beautiful, but in no way matched the situation and the upcoming tea party. Radish smiled sweetly and replied that there was nothing sweet left in the house that could be offered to the guests, and drinking tea just like that was indecent. So she served the only thing she found. Urami smiled condescendingly and said that her friend had foreseen this development of events, so she brought with her dried meat, which witches also need to eat in addition to vegetables. It turns out that before leaving, the friends talked about this topic, and Ram asked the store owner to look after her student. Claire felt ashamed that with her irresponsible behavior, she only confirmed her mentor's fears and that an outsider now had to take care of her. To which Urami replied that this is normal. It's just that every person has strengths and weaknesses, and friends are just needed to support in difficult times. Then the witch lowered her voice and added, looking Radish straight in the eyes, that she had to be especially careful today. Claire looked at the guest in surprise and asked what could happen to her, what she should be afraid of. Now what frightened her most was the lack of a smile on her interlocutor's face. Looking at the tea with tomatoes, the young sorceress thought that in many months of communication, Urami had never been so serious and wary. The experienced witch replied that if Radish plans to visit the capital in the near future, she should be extremely careful, since it can be extremely dangerous there. Claire moved the saucer and cup a little and asked for details because she did not understand the essence of the warning. Urami said that she has her own informant in the city, who announced a planned assassination attempt on an unknown important person, so it is better to avoid this place for a while. Radish was shocked by what she heard. She of course knew that there were palace intrigues and conspiracies, but she had never encountered it personally. The guest raised her finger to her lips and continued speaking, lowering her voice even further. According to her reliable source, the most likely assassination attempt will be made against the first Prince Gilbert. This news literally struck the girl on the spot because she had been thinking about him for so many months, but never decided to take any steps to meet. The shock was so strong that the fingers unclenched on their own, and the white porcelain cup flew down and then broke into pieces, spilling the fragrant tea around. Claire walked around the house and could not find a place for herself from the thoughts that overwhelmed her. Radish possessed valuable and important information, but did not know how to use it correctly. According to the store owner, it is most likely that they will try to poison the prince. Urami's source for the reason that this was most likely one of her regular clients, and they would not just deceive the witch. In addition, Claire was well aware of the palace intrigues and knew that Oliver was competing with the first prince for the status of heir to the throne. However, earlier Gilbert could not compete with the queen's son because he did not have a bride, but this was his only weakness. And while their engagement was in force, the voices of the common people were on Oliver's side, since a family man as a leader always evokes more sympathy among the common people than a bachelor. However, the guy was stupid, and in one fell swoop destroyed his entire reputation, which his noble bride had created for him over the years. Now when Gilbert returned from a military campaign as the absolute winner of monsters and a hero, the scales of people's love seriously swung in his direction. Claire remembered that very soon the election of the main contender for the crown would take place, and if the queen decided to kill her son's rival, then things were going very badly for Oliver. Young the witch sat on the floor and thought about the strange feeling that overwhelmed her from within, and she felt bad. Finally, the Margrave's heiress remembered that she once really wanted to thank her savior, and now a real opportunity arose to repay the debt. Radish thought that by covering for the fugitive, Gilbert himself decided to risk his position for her sake, which means the only thing she can do is reciprocate the prince's feelings. Looking at the smooth rectangles of the wooden parquet, the young witch began to think about her possible actions. The first idea that came to Claire's mind was to write the guy a letter outlining the gist of the information available to her and thus warning him about the assassination attempt. However, Radish doubted that they would listen to her words because she was on the royal wanted list, so she decided that it was necessary to act secretly. The first thing the girl decided to start with was changing her appearance. This was not difficult to achieve by changing the color of her hair and eyes. Claire tried to make her new look as unremarkable as possible, and to make it different from her previous one. Then the witch used clothes from her mentor's wardrobe and put on a dark robe to make it easier to get lost in the crowd. Finally, the creation of a new personality was completed, and the girl stood in front of the portal. Inside were symbols of teleportation designed to instantly move over very long distances. Radish raised her hand and brought her palm to the bright circle. A feeling of extraordinary lightness appeared inside. Having uttered the necessary spell to herself, Claire opened her eyes wide and plunged into a lightning-fast adventure, setting off many kilometers from her forest refuge. The weather was good in the capital. Distant white clouds floated across the sky, and the houses rose unusually and loomed over the little witch who had lost the habit of the bustle of the city in recent months. The streets along which the girl walked were well known to her, but until that moment she had seen them exclusively from the window of her own carriage. The former bride noted to herself that during these 9 months everything remained as before in its place. Most of all, Claire rejoiced at freedom because she no longer had to carry out complex and responsible assignments and through force take care of the stupid royal offspring. Obeying an emotional impulse, Radish headed to the nearest clothing store to update her wardrobe. Walking between the racks with new dresses, the girl continued to enjoy freedom because she could choose any outfit, and not just the one that befits a prince's bride. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the counter, with eclairs cakes, cookies, and other sweets, and the witch immediately remembered that there was absolutely nothing at home for tea. Walking down the street with a full bag of all kinds of goodness, Claire suddenly heard a noise behind her. Turning around, Radish couldn't even believe her eyes. Not far from her in the crowd of fans he stood, her savior, Prince Gilbert. The witch watched the impressive crowd gathered in the middle of the street and wondered what she should do next. Meanwhile, the guy stood surrounded by fans and listened to their affectionate and flattering chirps, and then asked how they were doing. The young girls squealed with delight that the prince himself had paid attention to them and rushed to vie with each other to tell how well they were doing. Claire stood in her hiding place, watched this picture, and thought about why everything was happening this way and who he really was. Then Radish pulled herself together, moved away from the corner, and closed her eyes because she had come here to save Gilbert and not to compete with the crowds of fans. The young witch's plan was quite simple and promised to be very effective. Claire wanted to quietly cast a special witch spell on the first prince, which was supposed to protect the guy from the deadly effects of the poison. It was a simple and quite powerful charm that would make the prince immune to any poison that entered the body through food, air, skin, or otherwise. The difficulty was that to cast the spell, the witch needed direct contact with the subject being enchanted, that is, Radish must touch the prince. All that remained was to pretend to be one of his fierce admirers who constantly hovered around the commander of the knights in a whole flock, and then try to reach out with his hand. The witch came out of hiding and went to catch up with the crowd leaving along the street. However, after some time, Claire gave up trying to get closer to her savior because the fans stood around the object of their adoration so tightly that it was impossible to approach. The girl was sincerely surprised how Gilbert himself could withstand such strong pressure from female society. Finally, the guy loudly apologized to everyone and said that he needed to leave, he had business. Sandwiched in the crowd, Radish tried to squeeze through to the first prince, but this task was beyond her. Having failed to achieve her goal, the witch decided to eat a little to gather her thoughts and gain strength for new adventures. Devouring the cakes with gusto, Claire realized that her original plan had failed miserably, which means she needed a new one. After thinking a little, the secret savior decided to sneak into Gilbert's house so that she could definitely fulfill her plans there. The prince's house did not look like some kind of separate mansion of an influential nobleman, quite the opposite. Rather, it was more like a barracks where knights lived in separate rooms. Taking the form of a striped cat as her mentor once did, Radish crept up to the building with a soft gait and climbed along a tree branch to the very roof. Now all that remained was to find the prince and touch him so that the poison dispersal spell would reliably protect the guy from danger. Claire was very pleased with herself that she remembered the existence of this unusual spell, which temporarily turns the witch into a cat-she, barely distinguishable from an ordinary cat. The fluffy animal with a red bow began to carefully study the building to find the room where Gilbert lived. When the witch was still in the city and was in a crowd of fans, she heard the girls discussing his new home on the top floor. This narrowed the search and made the task easier. The prince specifically chose the most inaccessible room because at night naive townspeople often tried to sneak into his window. Finally, having reached the right place, Radish made some efforts and tried to get inside. The attempt was successful, and the furry animal was one step closer to realizing its own plan to save the prince. For a moment, Claire hesitated. She thought that in other circumstances she would never have gone secretly into the room of an unfamiliar guy at night. But there was no time to think, it was necessary to act, so the brave kitten continued his adventures. The prince's home was not at all like the abode of an influential person. There were few objects, and they were very simple, without carved backs and gilded inserts or other elements of luxury. Since the katchi is a very short animal, she could clearly see the floor and hard-to-reach places that people don't always pay attention to, while absolute order and perfect cleanliness reigned everywhere. Claire even somehow became jealous that she could not give things in her house at least some semblance of a harmonious arrangement, as it was here. Suddenly, Radish felt movement behind her and realized that she was not alone in the room. The fur on her back immediately stood on end. However, turning around, her anxiety and fear were immediately replaced by joy and calm. Of course, the witch was not happy that her presence was revealed, because she wrapped herself in a cat-she to do everything unnoticed. But Gilbert stood in front of her, which means that everything else was no longer so important, because now they were finally alone, and no one would interfere with his salvation. Not realizing who was really in front of him, the prince leaned closer to the cat, began to examine her collar, and ask where her owner was. Claire stood hidden behind a chair leg, and watched as her savior addressed her like an ordinary curious cat who had run into the wrong place. Radish came out of her hiding place, and the guy suggested that the animal might be hungry. Then Gilbert handed the fluffy witch a saucer of delicious cookies that you couldn't buy in a regular candy store. The girl, in the guise of a cat, immediately recognized the delicacy. It was sold only to representatives of noble blood in a special store called Kronos. It was indeed very tasty. Claire used to frequent this establishment, and since she had a sweet tooth, she knew all its products by heart. Radish looked at the prince and didn't know if she could try this food because she was now in the form of a cat, not a human, and whether it would somehow affect her body. The commander of the knights, seeing the confusion of the tabby cat, suggested that his presence might frighten her, and therefore he would move away so that she would not be alarmed and enjoy the treat. The witch was touched by such kind and caring treatment towards a completely unfamiliar and strange cat. Claire decided to give in to temptation, reasoning that Gilbert should not suspect anything, then she would be able to get as close to him as possible. Kachi grabbed the cookies with both paws and began to devour the offered food with joy and pleasure. The delicacy was not just tasty, it was excellent because no matter what delicacies the mentor bought in the city, access to the most exquisite delicacies was limited for her. Each cookie was a work of culinary art with a thin, crispy crust and a soft, airy filling. While devouring the exquisite food, Radish literally forgot about everything in the world at that moment. There was only her, the sweetness and unsurpassed taste, spreading joy and pleasure throughout her entire body. Gilbert, who had been condescendingly watching the cat all this time, noticed that judging by the speed of eating, the furry guest liked the meal. The witch looked away from the cookies for a moment and thought about how she could always remain so cold and calm. With each episode of their communication, Claire liked the prince more and more, his clean-room noble deeds and willingness to share his own for the sake of someone else's being. Leaving the bowl empty, the cat wiped her mouth with her paw and mentally thanked the owner for such a warm welcome to the uninvited guest. Seeing that the meal had been successfully completed, the guy noticed that it was blowing strongly from the window and suggested that the pet climb higher so as not to catch a cold. Gilbert patted the surface of the sofa with his hand, inviting the cat to sit closer to him. The witch was a little afraid to approach this unusual person, but this is exactly what she wanted, and this is what she came here for, having overcome a lot of difficulties and obstacles along the way. To top it all off, the prince sitting on the bed simply closed his eyes, thereby making it clear that he should not be afraid since he was ready to completely trust the tabby cat. Fear still constrained Claire's movements a little, but she began to confidently move towards her intended goal because he was so close. Then Radish saw a towel lying on the sofa, and suddenly it dawned on her that the guy had put it there especially for her. Meanwhile, Gilbert picked up the book and began to read it carefully, as if not noticing at all that there was a small furry creature next to him. The witch lay down on the bed prepared for her and began to carefully observe the prince. The commander of the knights was thinking about something of his own. It seemed that he was recalling pictures of bygone days, going over in his memory the surviving episodes that were dear to his heart. And suddenly a long-forgotten photograph of Gilbert's mother surfaced in Claire's head. In it the woman was not alone but together with a cat. Maybe that's why her son took in an unfamiliar pet. The fire in the fireplace opposite the sofa burned brighter, filling the room with warmth and comfort. The guy silently continued to read some book sitting on the opposite edge of the sofa. Radish thought that she had a great snack, even more than that she ate heavily, as evidenced by her inflated fluffy tummy and the feeling of weakness and drowsiness spreading throughout her body. Finally, Gilbert looked away from the book and looked at the curled-up cat who was dozing sweetly lying on his towel. The knight commander wished Katja sweet dreams, but she no longer heard him because she was fast asleep. A cool night breeze blew in from the window and the flames in the fireplace flickered but then straightened out. Claire, in the form of a cat, woke up stretched sweetly and thought that existence still determines consciousness, because finding herself in the form of a furry animal, she began to act differently than she had planned. Then Radish looked at the prince and calmed down, because he had not gone anywhere but simply lay down in his bed and was now fast asleep. Gilbert's head rested on the pillow, and the light sniffles of a peacefully sleeping man escaped from his chest. Claire decided that she had lost a lot of precious time, and now her time had come to save the prince. The witch put her furry paw on the guy covered with a blanket and began to prepare to cast a protective spell. She also made sure that there were no signs of poison inside the prince's body. Casting a spell in a non-human form was a little strange and unusual, but quite real and feasible. The magical cover tightly covered the unsuspecting commander of the knights, providing reliable and durable internal armor against any type of poison. When everything was ready, Radish jumped out of bed and slowly set off on her way back. Finally, the cat Claire turned around and looked with some longing at the peacefully sleeping and unsuspecting Prince Gilbert. It was still golden autumn when Urami and her assistant Noah once again visited the hut in the forest and checked on the student who was left alone on the farm. The young witch joyfully greeted the guests on the threshold of the house and expressed regret that they came to her so rarely. This time Claire was ready and bought a sweet snack for tea in the city in advance, which made her friends incredibly happy. Noah and her teacher were pleasantly surprised by such changes in the house of their witch friend Ram. Radish replied that last time she was very ashamed, and so she decided to try not to lose face and restore her reputation. Uremi smiled and replied that the girl was literally growing before her eyes, becoming more responsible and independent every month. Noah thought about it too, but couldn't say it out loud because talking with her mouth full was indecent, and the treat was so delicious that she simply couldn't tear herself away from it. Claire was very pleased with herself, because now she understood how important it was to prepare for important events and not just stand and blush in front of the guests. Over a cup of tea, Uremi announced the important news that she would not be able to come for orders for the next month, as she would be on a business trip. The witch received an offer to set up magical equipment, but she would have to travel far, and for at least 3 to 4 weeks. Noah will be in charge of purchasing ordering elixirs and the store during the mentor's trip. Suddenly, Uremi thought for a second, and then invited Radish to accompany her on this journey. Claire was very surprised by this offer because she had never traveled before, especially with a witch and on magical issues. The owner of the magic shop also added that she is not going to entrust the girl with any responsibilities. She just wants to introduce her a little to the huge world around her. Radish asked if she would become a burden to the magic toolmaster, to which Uremi replied that she would be much more pleased to make this trip together. Claire began to think about this curious proposal and turn over in her head the reasons why she should agree to it. While still an ordinary girl, the Margrave's heir read many books and always dreamed of going on a journey, but now, having acquired magical powers, she wanted to see the work of a real witch. However, along with all the obvious advantages and personal benefits from this trip, there was one more nuance that Claire could not ignore. Radish did not want to go so far from Gilbert, the feelings for whom in her heart were growing and strengthening every day. Therefore, the girl thanked Uremi for the opportunity to realize her old dreams, but refused. The store owner was sympathetic to Claire's choice and did not insist, but noted that while she had not yet left, Ram's assistant could always change her decision. In the evening of the same day when twilight fell on the forest area, the witch approached the portal and activated the teleport. Fluffy white paws glided softly and silently over the familiar squares on the floor. The modest and austere furnishings of the prince's room gradually became familiar and ceased to surprise the cat witch. Now Claire, in the guise of a cat, visited the guy as often as she could, and his cozy home gradually became a second home for her. The commander of the knights was only glad to see her visits and tried to treat his new girlfriend with delicious delicacies every time. In response, Radish usually meowed joyfully each time anticipating a new delicious dish from elite confectionery shops, and Gilbert carefully selected each time more and more rare and delicious sweets sold exclusively in shops for the upper class. Claire furiously attacked the next cookie, which melted in her mouth and left behind an unforgettable wave of pleasure and satiety. The little sweet tooth thought that no sweets available to ordinary people could compare with what the best chefs in the kingdom prepared for noble and wealthy gentlemen. The prince even began collecting reviews about delicacies from his subordinates in order to always be able to offer only the best dishes. Initially, Radish came to the guy to make sure that the spell she had cast against the poison had weakened, but she soon realized that she could no longer live long without these visits. But it cannot be said that the basis of her nightly adventures were only emotions, since Gilbert had a very strong magical gift, and the spell could begin to dissolve against his background. And the prince himself began to get used to this unusual cat with a sweet tooth. She reminded him of the cat she that his late mother had tamed, and he looked forward to her visit, replacing his pillow with a towel. Passion for Claire's late-night snacking took it to a new level. At some moments, it was impossible to even understand what she wanted more: check a spell, see the prince, or have a sweet meal. The only thing that slightly embarrassed Radish during these late visits was the need to appear in the form of a cat, which means following certain rules of animal behavior. After a hearty dinner, the witch as a rule climbed into her rightful place and curling up in a ball quickly fell asleep. During this time, the Margrave's heiress got to know Gilbert quite well because the guy did not know that he was being watched, which means he behaved naturally and at ease. It remained a mystery why the prince had such a bad reputation as a consummate womanizer and heartthrob, because not one of these rumors was ever confirmed by an attentive cat. Instead of the endless love affairs attributed to the guy, he had only books on his mind, and even those were not romantic, but teaching military affairs, politics, and state building. Against this background, Claire sometimes remembered Oliver, who almost never picked up printed matter, believing that noble blood and servants would help him out of any trouble. Based on her personal and rather long-term observations, it turned out that the rumors attributed and spread among the people about Gilbert were an absolute lie and a provocation. Radish also did not understand why the prince did not strive to dispel the thick fog of untruth that had been enveloping his person for many, many years. The witch's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a sharply slammed book, which the guy put on the table after intensive reading. The knight commander noted that he had a long and difficult day planned for tomorrow, and therefore he needed to get a good night's sleep. Then Gilbert approached the blue-eyed cat, digesting another portion of delicious cookies, and said that she was very smart. And he noticed, looking straight into her large, wide-open eyes, that he felt more human than feline in her. And then the prince raised his hand low and did something he had never done before. The guy affectionately stroked the cat's head, causing it to purr and its eyes to glow with happiness. The commander of the knights wished the animal good night and went to bed to gain strength for the coming day. Looking out the window at the moon hanging high in the sky, Claire thought about her life, about the prince, and about what had happened to her over all these last months. At some point, Radish decided to admit to herself honestly why she came here in the first place. Yes, she really liked this delicious, delicious food, and was attracted by the feeling of peace and comfort that the witch experienced while lying on the pillow with a full stomach. But in fact, Claire understood this now more clearly than ever she came to the prince, because they were united by a feeling of loneliness. The girl spent the whole day reading books or at the boiler, and there was no one around because Ram still had not returned from the trip. And Gilbert, when he finishes his business for the day, returns to his humble abode all alone. Kachi. Claire thought that this feeling really brings similar people together, creating some kind of invisible connection between them. She jumped off the sofa and confidently walked towards the knight commander's bed, as she had done many times before. Jumping onto the mattress, the cat slowly crept up to the prince from behind so as not to wake him. And with the usual movement of her striped paw, she checked the state of the body of the possible heir to the crown. However, this time everything was different. A feeling of threat and impending disaster appeared inside. Anxious Claire began re-diagnosis to confirm or refute her worst fears.